All right, David, what do you say? Should we finish off the series?
Let's do it.
All right, wonderful. For those of you who have not participated or have not been here yet, let me introduce to you the Reverend Dr. David Marshall, who has been leading us on an introduction to Anglicanism, both a historical introduction, but also through some of the unique figures in Anglican history that exemplify some of the traditions within Anglicanism. So we talked about the Anglo-Catholic, the liberal Protestant, the evangelical, and now he's going to talk about a figure who kind of doesn't really fit any of those categories. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
All right.
Okay.
Look forward to it.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you, Nicholas, and good morning to you all. It's wonderful to be with you again. Well, as Nicholas just helpfully summarized where we've been, that's what I was going to begin just by briefly reviewing where we are and the kind of figures we've looked at from the different categories that he mentioned. And yes, indeed, the figure we're going to look at today is one who doesn't really fit in that three-way categorization of types of Anglican thinker, of evangelical, Anglo-Catholic, liberal. I've included him for various reasons. One is that a lot of people love his work. I imagine some of you know his work and love it. Some maybe not so enthusiastic, but I certainly think he's worth reflecting on because he is probably the most widely read Anglican of all time. Have I mentioned his name yet? C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is the figure we're looking at today. He is hard to categorize. Of the figures we've looked at before, probably he has least in common with the radical, progressive, liberal modernist, John Robinson, who wrote Honest to God, that we looked at 2 weeks ago. Lewis was pretty firmly opposed to the kind of revision of traditional Christian doctrines and practice promoted by liberals like John Robinson. If you know his little book, The Great Divorce, which is a sort of imaginative work set in hell, no, sorry, not in, no, in, is it in hell? Yes, yes, it is in hell. You will perhaps remember that he includes a scathing picture of an unbelieving Church of England bishop, somewhat of the same school of thought of John Robinson. So he was not particularly sympathetic to that kind of approach. In some respects, one could say he's closest to figures like John Stott, the influential evangelical who we looked at. Like Stott, he would want to hold on to an unwatered down version of the faith, and he would want confidently to present reasons for believing. He has that broadly evangelical drive to persuade people of the truth of the Christian faith and to call people to believe in Jesus Christ. Not surprisingly, therefore, he tends to be very popular with evangelicals, I think especially in the USA, and I think it's no accident that it is at the it's sometimes called the Evangelical Harvard, Wheaton College near Chicago, that the Lewis Archive has been preserved. But he's not totally in the evangelical mold either. In some respects, he's more Anglo-Catholic. For example, he is not so constantly focused on the Bible as Stott is. He engages much more with the tradition, the great thinkers of the Catholic tradition from the past. And Anglo-Catholics also appreciate him greatly. There is, for example, a fine book by Rowan Williams, the Anglo-Catholic recent Archbishop of Canterbury, about Lewis's Narnia books. I'll say a bit about this later, The Lion's World, in which he's very appreciative of Lewis. So one could say there are both Catholic and evangelical strands in him, but not much of the liberal tradition, so much one could say. So he's rather distinctive among the figures we've thought about. And here's another point. They were all, or in Lewis and William's case, still, he's still alive. They are all ordained priests, some of them bishops as well. Lewis is the one lay person we're considering in this survey of Anglicans. He did not undergo theological study or training for ministry in the church. His training was as a scholar, and in particular a scholar of English literature. And yet, he's had far more popular success than any of the others that we've thought about. His books have sold in huge numbers, probably the most widely read Anglican writer ever. And I'd like to reflect on what explains Lewis's huge popularity. Before I turn to that, let's just look briefly at the outline of his life, and I give you some of his dates and some key points about his life on the handout under the photo of him. So he's born in 1898 in Belfast, Northern Ireland, from a fairly privileged background, privately educated. He's of that generation that was called up to serve in the First World War. He was wounded in 1918, so although he ended up in the ivory towers of Oxford and Cambridge, he had seen the wider world. He'd had personal exposure to war and all its terror. He returned to Oxford. He came to Oxford after the war and studied classics, philosophy, English literature. Very successful young scholar, became a lecturer with a focus particularly on medieval and early modern English literature, on which he published widely. And quite apart from his reputation as a Christian writer, he's a highly distinguished scholar of English literature. But note, I mentioned medieval and early modern English literature. By early modern, I would mean people like John Milton from the 17th century. Mainly his focus is earlier than that, figures from the 16th century and even earlier. This is not a man in love with what is most recent and fashionable. His mind is to a large extent focused on the classics of the past. That's true both as his work as a scholar of literature and in his reading of great works of Christian theology and spirituality. He tends to be rather critical of that which is of the moment and which is sort of fashionable right now. I think he instinctively feels suspicious of modern trends and tends to want to go with the tried and tested classics of the past. Now, quite early, I think already as a teenager, he had become quite agnostic and continued through all his studies and his early life as a professor to be agnostic. But he formed friendships with Christian believers at Oxford. Notably, he was roughly contemporary with Tolkien, and some of these friends had quite an influence on him. And gradually in his early 30s, he opens up. And finally, by 1931, he acknowledged belief in Christ as the Son of God. And he gives an account of his progression to Christian faith in an autobiographical memoir, Surprised by Joy. He soon started writing about Christianity, having embraced the faith. And he quickly became a very popular speaker, and in the war was a very popular and influential radio broadcaster. And he broadcast a series of talks which came to be published as Mere Christianity. We're going to listen to a little bit of that in a moment. While at Oxford, it's famous that he was part of a group of friends, many of them also confessing Christians, like Tolkien, another interesting Anglican novelist and poet and literary critic, Charles Williams, who together were called the Inklings. If you have visited Oxford, you may have visited the famous pub called the Eagle and Child, which they as a group used to meet in, and they called it the Bird and Baby on the high street in, not the high street, what is it? I forget the name of it now, right in the center of Oxford. You may have seen the film Shadowlands, a very poignant film about Lewis's marriage to an American woman called Joy Davidman, a rather unlikely match, very, very different people. He was a bachelor until this time, in his 50s. He marries her in rather strange circumstances and then becomes a deep love, which is then leads into tragedy as she's considerably younger than him, but she contracts cancer and dies. And that experience of grief, of love and then grief, is memorably reflected in another autobiographical work, but not so much an autobiographical work as in telling his story, but just reflecting on the experience of loss, a grief observed. He moved to a professorship at Cambridge late in his life and died in 1963. So that's the life in outline. But I'd like to come back to the point I was making earlier, about this question: how do we best explain the huge and enduring popularity of C.S. Lewis, whose works still now 60 years after his death are still selling in vast numbers? I mean, we looked a couple of weeks ago at John Robinson's book, Honest to God, which at the time made a huge splash. It's not very widely read today. Lewis's work continues to be very widely read. There seems to be a sort of enduring appeal to it. I'd like to give an impression of his work by focusing on two key types of writing he produced. Firstly, books that seek to address the hard questions that agnostics or unbelievers, such as he had been for much of his, alert to the power of these questions. He's sympathetic to them and he deals with them seriously. And that kind of book is called apologetic, not because it's embarrassed and making an apology, but because it is offering an apologia or reasoned argument for holding the Christian faith. And possibly his most famous book of all, Mere Christianity, is in this category. Then secondly, fiction. He wrote a number of fictional works. He himself, I've read that of all his books, he most loved a story he wrote called Till We Have Faces. I'm not going to speak about that today. It's a mysterious book. It's a kind of retelling of a Greek myth. And that's very much written for adults. But I'm going to written for children, but much loved by adults also. And these books are not just stories for their own sake, though Lewis would have laughed and said, well, what would the harm be in that? They are also deeply rooted in Christian faith, and they are inviting a deeper understanding and love of that faith. And I've chosen these two types of his work because if we hold these two types of book together, we can say that Lewis writes sometimes in a style that primarily appeals to reason, as in Mere Christianity, and sometimes to imagination in these books for children. But it's never just one or the other. He's committed to the importance of both reason and imagination. And he believes Christianity addresses both these vital aspects of the human being and indeed satisfies them both wonderfully if we will only open our reason and imagination to the Christian message. So let's turn now to look at how Lewis's work appeals to both reason and imagination. So looking first at reason and Mere Christianity, I've included a number of quotations from this work in your handout. It's a book that brings together, as I mentioned, a series of radio talks he gave during the Second World War. Since publication, it's been for over 80 years, perhaps the most popular, short, relatively accessible introduction to Christianity in English. And at this point, if I may, Nicholas, I think it would be nice to hear the voice of C.S. Lewis. I've never discovered this until yesterday when I was preparing for this session. There is this one short link that has been preserved of all the tapes that the BBC made. We'll just listen to about 3 minutes at the beginning of this recording to just give some idea of his style. It very much reminds me of the voice of my grandfather, not the kind of accent you would hear today.
I can believe in God, all right, but what I can't swallow is this idea of existence of several hundred million human beings. We're all addressing to the same boat. And I find quite a lot of people feel that yesterday. Well, the first thing to notice is that the whole sting of it comes in the words at the same moment. Most of us can imagine God attending to any number of games, if only they come one by one. He has an endless time to do it. So what's really effective is this idea of God having to fit too many things into one moment of time. Well, that of course is what happens to us. Our life comes to us moment by moment. One moment disappears before the next comes along, and there's room for precious living. That's what time is like. And of course, you and I tend to take it for granted that this time series, this arrangement of the past, present, and future, isn't simply the way life comes to us, but is the way things really exist. We tend to assume that the whole universe and God himself are always moving on from a past to a future, just the way I am. But many don't believe that. I think we are noticed first and after some things are not in time. Later philosophers, and now some scientists are doing the same. Almost certainly, God is not in time. His life doesn't consist of moments following one another. If a million people are praying at 10:30 tonight, he hasn't got to listen to them all in that one little snippet which we call 10:30. 10:30. And every other hope from the beginning to the end of the world is always the present for him. You like that?
That's good. Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. So I'm glad to have just been able to give you that opportunity to hear his voice from so long ago, but also just to get a sense of the way that he can take the question of the ordinary person who is wondering about Christian faith, and presents with a question which arises out of the context of thinking about something quite practical, like about prayer. How can God attend to everybody praying at the same time and so forth? So it's a very basic question, maybe one might say even a child's question, but it's a question which the great thinkers of the Christian tradition have addressed, the question of the relationship between God and time. But he gets into that question in a very unpatronizing and yet very accessible way. He doesn't throw around long and complex words and show off that he's read the great works of philosophy and theology, but he takes people into the heart of of a profound question: God and time. How are we to understand these things? And that's typical of what he's doing a lot of the time. I'm going to say a little bit about Mere Christianity. I've got about 10 minutes or so now to say something about this book. I can't possibly reproduce the whole argument, but I'm just going to give you a sense of some of the things he says to give you a taste of the sort of way in which he seeks to give a reasoned account, an apologia for the Christian faith. Interesting to read a few lines from the preface. The reader should be warned that I offer no help to anyone who is hesitating between two Christian denominations. You will not learn from me whether you ought to become an Anglican, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, or a Roman Catholic. There's no mystery about my own position. I'm a very ordinary layman of the Church of England, not especially high, like Anglo-Catholic, nor especially low, evangelical, nor especially anything else. But in this book, I'm not trying to convert anyone to my own position as an Anglican, although he is trying to convert people to Christianity, understood more generally. Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. So notice a few hallmarks here. Interesting what he says about Anglicanism, thinking about the people we looked at later. I mean, in a way typical of all Anglicans, he's not that bothered that you should be an Anglican. Now, some churches would say, wouldn't just want somebody to become a Christian in general, but would want to say, become a Christian and become part of our church because we are the true church. Anglicanism has never really said that. It regards itself as part of the true church. But if you want to become a Methodist or Roman Catholic, that's fine. The important thing is that you become a Christian. And that's what Lewis is saying here as well. So it's an ecumenical outlook at the beginning. But notice also this unashamed desire to present the Christian faith and persuade people of its truth. He has himself relatively recently become a Christian, and he wants to persuade others of the truth of this faith that he has embraced. So he's going to give a reasoned account of Christianity, and he starts not by quoting the Bible or explaining Christian doctrines in a way that perhaps an evangelical might begin the exposition. Instead, he focuses on human experience, and he develops his argument from that. He's going to argue for what he calls the law of human nature, the idea that there is in everyone a sense of moral accountability, and he will then go on to argue that this fact points to the existence of something or someone to whom we are morally accountable. So he writes this, with a delightful, as it were, just eavesdropping on ordinary life and drawing profound conclusions from it. Everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny, sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant, but however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kind of things they say. They say things like this: how do you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave him alone. He isn't doing you any harm. People say things like that every day, educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups. Now, what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He is appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about, and the other man very seldom replies, "To hell with your standard." And so, skipping a bit, he goes on, "It seems then we are forced to believe in a real right and wrong, which everybody instinctively acknowledges one way or another." And skipping on a bit further, now, if we are agreed about that, I go on to my next point, which is this: none of us are really keeping the law of nature. These then are the 2 points I want to make. First, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way, and they cannot really get rid of it. Secondly, they do not, in fact, behave in that way. They know the law of nature, but they break it. These 2 facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. So in other words, he has sketched out the human predicament as he sees it. And then he turns to how God, in Christian belief, responds to our predicament, our need. He refers to the conscience God has planted in us, to the truths scattered among the world's religions and philosophies and myths, to the calling of the people of Israel, and then finally to God sending Jesus. And he comes then to probably what is the most famous argument in this book. Not everybody finds it persuasive. Some people would say it's a bit simplistic, but it's very famous. I think it's important to include it. And this is it. He writes, "Then comes the real shock. Among these Jews, there suddenly turns up a man who goes about talking as if he was God. He claims to forgive sins. He says he has always existed. He says he is coming to judge the world at the end of time. What this man said was quite simply the most shocking thing that has ever been uttered by human lips. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on a level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to." So that's a key argument he makes about Jesus Christ. And then on the basis of Christian trust in him as the Son of God, he then goes forward to explain some of the key features of Christian belief and practice. And I'm just going to give the final appeal. These are the very last words of the book, which give a sense of not just reasoned argument, but of passionate appeal as well. He says there must be a real giving up of the self if you are to be serious about the Christian faith. You must throw the self away blindly, so to speak. Christ will indeed give you a real personality. Give up yourself and you will find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will ever be really yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him, and with him, everything else thrown in. So I want to underline that although the book is primarily presenting a reasoned argument, this is not a dry, detached rationality. It is, if you like, reason on fire, passionate reason, reason appealing also to ordinary experience in a very accessible way, reason making use of vivid images, an appeal to our reason, which also appeals to our imagination. Let's look at this the other way around now by turning to Lewis's Narnia stories. Here he's primarily presenting stories that appeal to our imagination, and he does so vividly, brilliantly. He's a master storyteller. But while appealing to our imaginations, he's also making us think. He's drawing us into traditional Christian reasoning, and in ways that make it enter deeply into hearts and minds. So, a little introduction to the Narnia stories. These are 7 stories in which children from this world have adventures in another world called Narnia, in the course of which Lewis unfolds many of the great truths of the Christian faith. And he also provides many memorable illustrations of aspects of the Christian life. Here is just some of the main themes that we can draw from these books. One has been, I think, quite accurately styled disputed sovereignty. Just as Christ, in Lewis's view, as a believing Christian, just as Christ is the true Lord of this world, even though many ignore him or doubt his existence, so in Narnia, the true Lord is the lion, Aslan. And just as in our world, many forces, many philosophies compete to have the attention and loyalty that we should give to Christ, so in Narnia, there are many usurpers, evil rulers, who seek to rule over Narnia, drawing people away from belief and loyalty to Aslan, their true king, and bringing misery to them as a result. Now, in the first book he wrote, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Narnia is under the spell of a witch, and the effect of her evil rule is to keep it in an oppressed, frozen state. A memorable phrase says that under the witch's rule in Narnia, it is always winter, but never Christmas. And as the story unfolds, Aslan returns. He finally overthrows the witch, winter ends, and he restores his creatures to life and freedom. And in the course of the story, the children learn much about him. The first lesson occurs when Susan, one of the children, asks the beavers, who are creatures who are loyal to Aslan, if the lion Aslan is safe, to which Mr. Beaver replies, "Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you." The stories of Aslan also, they teach many profound truths about Christ. In particular, that Aslan has to sacrifice his life at the hands of the wicked witch and her cohort in order to redeem one of the children, Edmund, who has been a traitor, who has betrayed Aslan and his brothers, his brother and sisters, who has given himself over into the power of the witch. In order for Edmund to be redeemed, Aslan must submit to being sacrificed by the witch. Like Christ, he lays down his life and is restored to life. So he's a wonderful figure in this children's story of the Christ who is truly king, but who is a self-sacrificing, crucified Lord and Savior. So another point then, which relates to what I've just been mentioning, is that of deception. The false rulers in Narnia, these usurpers like the witch, the usurpers of Aslan's true authority, are deceivers. They spread lies to keep Narnia's creatures under the control. Even the children can be deceived. I've mentioned that Edmund is for a while deceived by the wicked witch into thinking he would do better to join her side and forget about Aslan. And in a story with memorable resonances for any child, she lures him in with the offer of hot chocolate and Turkish delight on a cold day when he's shivering outside. And there are other deceivers in other stories, like the ape Shift in the last book, The Last Battle, who, in order to present himself as Aslan returned, he's a kind of antichrist figure, dresses up in a mangy lion's skin and manages to deceive many creatures. And for Lewis, the point is that the Christian must learn to see through the deceptions of this world. Another major theme running through these stories is that of conversion, transformation, coming to true self-knowledge. They are stories of growth and change, of spiritual and moral transformation. The children grow in their understanding of Aslan, of Christ, of the world, and of themselves. Perhaps the best example is from the story, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, of a boy called Eustace who begins as a thoroughly obnoxious, arrogant, selfish child who, however, is powerfully changed by his encounter with Aslan, but gradually, not all at once. He, for a while, undergoes the traumatic experience of being turned into a dragon because of his greed for treasure. He gradually realizes how miserable his selfishness has made him, and eventually he is restored by Aslan as a human child, but only after he consents to entering into a lake with Aslan where he is submerged, washed, and Aslan literally, with his great lion claws, tears the dragon's skin off Eustace to reveal the newly restored child underneath. And that's a terribly painful process. Clear symbolism there of dying and rising with Christ, symbolism of new life through repentance and baptism. One final theme, and I'll be wrapping up fairly soon. The theme of longing for God, the theme of heaven as our true home. And this theme runs through all the stories and in much else of Lewis's writing. I was thinking as I prepared this, that there's a wonderful sermon of Lewis called The Weight of Glory. Although he was a layman, he was invited to preach often. You can find all his sermons and such like online. The Weight of Glory has a wonderful passage at the beginning which powerfully expresses this theme of longing for God and never being fully satisfied with anything that this world can offer. In our life in this world, we all have a longing for something transcendent this world cannot give. And this echoes St. Augustine's theme of our hearts being restless till we rest in God. Many passages convey the Christian hope for a life beyond this one. For example, the very last words of the last story, particularly dear to me, the end of The Last Battle, goes as follows. And I remember reading this, I must have been about 8. It's one of those things I can remember where I was in the house where I grew up when I read this. And it blew me away. I'd never read anything like this. And it created this sense of a vast space, of something far bigger than I had ever thought of. It achieved exactly the effect Lewis was wanting to achieve, that of creating in one a sense of longing for a richness and expansiveness in life that one had not yet discovered. This is just the last few lines. All their life in this world, the children, all their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the title and the cover page. Now at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. I'm afraid there isn't time to read it now, but I've also included on your handout at the end a passage from the end of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is also about that sense of longing for the beauty of heaven, where one is fully at home with God and where God's creation is fully restored in all its awesome beauty. Do have a look at it if you have time afterwards. Sorry, there isn't time to include it now. So, first reason, then imagination. Just as we saw with Mere Christianity, a work that appeals primarily to reason, but in which there is also a constant interwoven imaginative power at work. So conversely, in the Narnia stories, we have stories that appeal to the imagination, children and of adults, but through which Christian thinking, one can even say, even when children are reading it, I would say Christian theological and moral reasoning is being formed. So in Lewis, we have a man of extraordinary gifts of both intellect and storytelling, man of reason and of imagination, who was captured by the Christian faith and dedicated his gifts to making it known in all its power and its beauty. And just a brief word about assessment of Lewis and his work. He was a man of his time, a man born before the First World War, still growing up in the Edwardian era. When we read his work now, probably most of us would find there are a few things he says that jar slightly painfully depending on our political and social views maybe, but I think most people would find some of the things he says a little awkward. Some theologians are a little bit dismissive of him. I suspect there may be more than a little jealousy in that, because we would all love to be able to write as effectively as Lewis can, and we would all love to be able to communicate profound and complex ideas as simply and accessibly as he can. But it is a matter of note that Rowan Williams, who is probably the greatest living Anglican theologian, does not sympathize with that dismissive attitude of many of his fellow academic theologians to Lewis, and wrote this book, The Lion's World, in which he is deeply appreciative of his achievement in the Narnia stories. So there is an enduring power and charm in the work of this Anglican layman. I hope I've given you some sense of what that's about, and if it prompts any of you to revisit, or even for the first time to visit some of his work, then I'll be delighted with that. So thank you for listening. I've included also just a list of some of his many works and one or two works about him in the various different categories in which he published.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. All right, we do have a few more minutes before the next service. We have to leave for the next service. So if anyone has any questions or comments about, I guess we could say about this figure, C.S. Lewis, or any of the previous sessions as well. Bruce.
Thank you for that. And it's just wonderful to recall C.S. Lewis and what he's done. What do you think he would think about the modern university? He's an amazing man who came, got over the intellectual snobbery and secularism and socialism and whatever, Oxford. I don't know what it is now, but what would he think of Harvard today?
Yeah, good question. In one of his books, I think it's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, this child, this obnoxious child, Eustace, who is redeemed, Lewis mentions his parents were sociologists. And that kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of where he's coming from. I mean, he was rooted in the intellectual traditions, the classical intellectual traditions, Greek and Latin, early English literature, and so on. He did read some modern fiction. I even read I read a very positive review of one of the novels of George Orwell that he wrote, for example. It wasn't that he never read anything modern, but he was predisposed. He tended to feel that we we do not go to the classics of the past enough. At the beginning, he has a preface to one of the great works of the early church, Athanasius, and he gives this advice, which I received as an undergraduate and tried, but always failed to fit. He said, always read one ancient book for every modern book you read. Don't be swayed by all the modern fashions. They come and go. And so that's a rather indirect way of coming around to the point. I think Lewis, a man of Lewis's spirit, would be struggling. He probably was in his own day as well with some of the developments in the modern university. I mean, I think, he was kind of he was a monarchist. His imagination was in the pre-modern world. Even democracy, I mean, he accepted democracy, it was part of the modern world, but his mind was so much in the past that he couldn't see all the values of the present as being self-evidently the best way to run the world. So I think he would be an awkward figure somewhere like Harvard or at Oxford today, in short. And I think you can probably read into that some of the issues over which he would struggle.
Anything else? Any other questions? You have another, Bruce?
Yeah, I really admire some of the things that he wrote, and I think he also had a way of finding the thin place. Today's Advent reading was on the thin places. And when he talks about, what's the book on joy? Surprised by Joy. He's looking at a little tin box that his brother put together, right? And it's a piece of moss or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he sees God in that, or sees through to something divine. And, there are a few like thin places. We get these times and places that are where we have these mystic experiences.
Yeah.
And he knows how to, it's amazing as an intellectual to be able to define that.
Yeah. No, thank you. I mean, it's a long time ago since I read Surprised by Joy. I strongly recommend it. It's powerful, both in terms of his own story, but also these glimpses of his mind, his heart, his sensibility. And you're right, there's this word that I put on your handout around the kind of longing for God. It's German word Sehnsucht, which describes the way that just any little thing, like moss in a little tin box, or reading a bit of one of the ancient Norse sagas that he used to love, can just set off a longing, a sense of, as you say, a thin place, an experience, just a physical location, something you read, which opens up a wider vista, widens your horizon, and leaves you with a sense of longing for more of the reality which we mainly are too busy to attend to. He's constantly wanting, as it were, to people to blow the dust of over-familiarity off life. I mean, in the Screwtape Letters, which I haven't mentioned, another masterpiece of his, see if you can find the recording that the British actor John Cleese made of those. They're worth reading, worth listening to. He talks about, if we could only see other people as what they really are. Every person we meet is made in the image of God, and gives us that every person we meet, however difficult we may find them, is in principle somewhere is a part of God's creation where we can encounter God. Thank you for reminding us of that aspect of his work. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments for David while you have him all the way from Switzerland?
That hotbed of Anglicanism, Switzerland.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this lecture series, if I'm not mistaken, began for you teaching a class on Anglicanism in Switzerland. Is that right? To the church where Helen works?
Yes, indeed. So my wife Helen is the chaplain, or if you like, the rector of the Anglican congregation here in the Swiss capital, Bern. Actually, although my main academic specialty is another field, I first taught a course on Anglicanism in North Carolina when I was teaching at Duke Divinity School. So I've taught it in various different forms in in different places. Yeah.
It's wonderful. Well, thank you again so much for everything, David. This has been a wonderful series, and it's always, there's so much richness to the Anglican tradition, and so much I think that we are not aware of. We get into the habit of just going to one place or one tradition, and we forget that there's just a huge variety and huge richness even within this one church. So thanks for highlighting some of those through some of these wonderful figures. And if you get nothing else, this impetus to go out and read some of these wonderful thinkers, even someone like Lewis, who you've probably read something, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, it's a challenge to read go into the other category. If you've read the Narnia books, read some of his nonfiction. If you're interested in more academic work, he's written in philosophy, he's written in English literature. So tons of resources here, but thank you for bringing those to mind, David, and for visiting us and taking the time out of your busy schedule to enlighten us.
It's been a joy. Blessings on the remaining days of Advent, and a joyful Christmas to you all when it comes. Thank you. Thank you for the
Merry Christmas
invitation.
to you. You're very welcome.
Bye now.